The dress had taken 40 days to finish. Clara knew this because she had counted every single one of them. 40 days of needle and thread, of fingers that bled by the light of dying candles, of deep blue fabric purchased with coins saved across 2 full winters. Her mother had called it a waste. Her sisters had laughed. But Clara had sewn each stitch with a quiet certainty she could not quite name, only feel. That night, as she stood before the polished bronze mirror in the room she shared with Marta, the youngest of her sisters, she saw something in her reflection that was not shame. "You look like you're attending your own funeral," Marta said, dragging a bone comb through her golden hair. "Dark blue, Clara. It's the color widows wear in the northern mountains." "And the color of constellations," Clara replied, without turning around. Marta scoffed. She was 18 years old, and carried the kind of beauty that filled a room before she even entered it. The other 2 sisters, Sina and Brisa, had already gone down to the carriage, wearing rose and gold gowns their father had commissioned from Veldra, the merchant city 2 days' ride away. Clara had refused the golden dress offered to her, not because she didn't want it, because she knew that tonight, of all nights, she needed to be herself, entirely, undeniably herself, because Edmund would be there. Edmund Voss, son of Lord Voss of the Ashfen Pack, had courted her for nearly a year. Not openly, not with declarations or gifts sent to her door, but in the way men of his station sometimes courted women of lesser standing, quietly, carefully, with whispered promises in corridors and a warm hand over hers during the harvest festival. He had told her, 3 weeks before the grand gathering, that he intended to declare her his chosen mate before the entire assembly of packs. She had believed him. That was perhaps her first mistake. The grand gathering of Caldenvale was held once every 3 years inside the great hall of Stonemark Castle, a fortress so ancient its walls had forgotten the names of the kings who built them. Every pack of the 7 territories sent representatives, alphas, betas, nobles, warriors, healers. The hall could hold 500 wolves, and tonight it seemed determined to hold every single one of them. Torches burned in iron brackets along walls draped with the banners of each pack. The silver wolf of the Grey Moor, the black stag of the Ashfen, the twin axes of the Durnwall, the red flame of the Kesrath. The smell of burning resin, roasted meat, spiced wine and leather filled the air so completely that Clara paused at the entrance just to breathe it in. She was 26 years old, unmarried, without a pack of her own, without a declared mate, without the title or the land that might have made her invisible status more bearable. In a world where most women of the wolf nobility were bonded by 21, Clara's continued solitude had become the kind of quiet scandal that families whispered about at long tables when the wine had been flowing too freely. Her father never said it aloud. He didn't need to. Her sisters said it constantly. "Try not to stand too close to me tonight," Sina murmured as they entered the hall, adjusting the silk glove on her left hand. "People will think we're a matched set, and the comparison will confuse them." "She means it will embarrass us," Brisa added pleasantly, as if commenting on the weather. Clara said nothing. She had learned, somewhere between her 20th and 23rd year, that words spent defending herself to her sisters were words wasted. She walked behind them, her back straight, her dark hair pinned high with 2 silver clips that had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who, by all accounts, had been formidable. Clara chose to believe she had inherited something of that. The hall was magnificent and overwhelming. Long stone tables ran the length of the room, laden with bread, roasted fowl, honeyed wine, dried fruits, and great wheels of aged cheese wrapped in cloth. Candles burned in iron chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceiling. The stone floor had been strewn with dried herbs that released their scent when stepped on. Cedar, sage, and something sharper that Clara didn't recognize, but that made the back of her neck prickle. She found a place at the edge of the gathering, not quite hidden, not quite visible, and searched the crowd for Edmund. She spotted him near the Ashvin banner. He was tall, fair-haired, and wearing the deep green of his pack with a silver brooch at his shoulder. He looked well. He looked at ease. He was laughing at something a man beside him had said, and the laugh reached his eyes, which Clara had once found charming and now merely noted. He had not seen her yet. She smoothed the front of her blue dress and waited. The evening moved through its familiar rhythms, greetings between pack lords, the formal acknowledgement of visiting alphas, a blessing spoken by the elder of the Stonemark hold. Wine was poured. Voices rose. The fire in the great hearth at the far end of the hall was fed until it roared high enough to cast dancing shadows across the stone rafters. Clara waited. It was nearly 2 hours into the gathering when Edmund finally moved through the crowd toward her. Her heart, which she had commanded to remain still, did not entirely obey. "Clara," he said, stopping before her with that careful expression she had seen him wear when he was choosing words. "You came. You knew I would," she said. "I did." He paused. The pause lasted too long. "I need to speak with you." She already knew. The way a person sometimes knows a thing before they know it. In the chest first, then slowly in the mind. "My father," Edmund began, "has arranged a formal declaration. Tonight, with Sina." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. "My sister," Clara said. "Your father agreed. Both families." He stopped, cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, Clara, I am. But a man in my position cannot what?" Her voice was quiet, controlled. She was proud of that, later. Cannot choose a woman without land or title. Cannot go against his father's arrangement. Cannot keep a promise made in a corridor when no one was watching. Edmund had the decency to look away. "I hope you understand," he said. "I understand perfectly," Clara replied. She turned and walked away before he could say anything further. She did not look back at Sina, who she could see from the corner of her eye had been watching the exchange with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite triumph, but something uncomfortable that lived between the two. Clara moved toward the far edge of the hall, near the great stone arch that opened onto the corridor leading to the inner courtyard. She needed air. She needed a moment that belonged entirely to her, without witnesses, without the weight of 500 wolves and their collective opinion of her continued stubborn existence as an unmated female of no particular consequence. She was 3 steps from the arch when she heard it. Not a sound, exactly. More like a shift in the air, a change in the quality of the silence around her, as though the noise of the hall had suddenly become aware of something and pulled back slightly, the way a crowd parts without deciding to part. She turned. 3 men stood at the entrance of the great hall. They had arrived without announcement, without fanfare, without the formal introduction that protocol required of visiting lords. And yet every head in that room had turned. Every conversation had faltered. The elder of Stonemark had gone still mid-sentence. Even the fire, it seemed, burned a little differently. The first was broad-shouldered and dark, with a sharp jaw, and the kind of restless energy that suggested he found standing still physically painful. He was scanning the room with bright, amused eyes, as if he had arrived at a feast, and was already deciding which part of it would entertain him most. The second was leaner, copper-haired, with a half-smile that suggested he was privately aware of something no one else in the room knew yet. His gaze moved through the crowd with the lazy confidence of someone who had never once needed to prove anything. The third stood slightly behind the other 2, and yet drew the eye more completely than either of them. He was tall, dark-haired, with gray eyes that Clara could distinguish even from across the hall. The kind of gray that was neither cold nor warm, but deeply, precisely still. He wore no crown. He wore no elaborate insignia. He wore dark leather and a black cloak, with a single clasp of iron at the shoulder, and he stood with the particular stillness of a man who had never in his life needed to make himself appear powerful, because power had never once left him. Clara did not know his face, but something ancient in her blood did. His eyes moved through the hall with the calm, unhurried attention of a man who was looking for something specific. And then they stopped. They stopped on her. Clara did not look away immediately. She knew she should. Every rule of conduct she had been taught since childhood, by her mother, by the pack elders, by the quiet social architecture of a world built on hierarchy and dominance, told her that a woman of her standing did not hold the gaze of an alpha she had never been introduced to. Certainly not across a crowded hall. Certainly not when that alpha's eyes carried the particular weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed without having to ask. But her feet had stopped moving, and her breath had steadied into something almost calm, and the gray eyes across the room did not release her. It lasted only a few seconds. Then the copper-haired man beside him leaned in and said something close to his ear, and the gray gaze shifted, and Clara exhaled and turned back toward the stone arch as though nothing had happened. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly still. That surprised her. She slipped through the arch and into the corridor beyond, where the noise of the hall became a low, distant murmur, and the air smelled of cold stone and the pine resin burning in the wall sconces. She walked until she found the small alcove she remembered from a previous gathering. A recessed window seat overlooking the inner courtyard, where a stone fountain stood dry and dark in the winter cold. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and allowed herself exactly 1 minute of feeling everything she had refused to feel inside the hall. Edmund's voice. "I need to speak with you." Sena's face. That expression that was not quite guilt. The promise made in a corridor. The 40 days of needle and thread. The deep blue dress that no one had complimented because no one had thought to look at her long enough to notice it. She breathed in. She breathed out. She pressed her fingers together and felt the small calluses along her right hand from years of sowing, of working the land beside the servants when the harvest were thin, of tasks that women of noble blood were not supposed to perform, but that Clara had never found degrading. Work had always felt honest to her in a way that very little else did. The minute passed. She stood, straightened the front of her dress, and prepared to go back inside. "You left rather quickly." The voice came from the entrance of the alcove. Clara turned. It was the broad-shouldered one, the dark-haired man with the restless eyes who had stood to the left of the gray-eyed stranger. Up close, he was younger than she had initially judged, perhaps 30, with the kind of face that had been rearranged by a fight or two, and was better for it. He leaned against the stone wall with his arms crossed, watching her with undisguised curiosity, and something that might have been amusement. "I needed air," Clara said simply. "In the middle of a gathering?" He tilted his head. "Something must have gone badly wrong. Nothing that concerns you." "Probably not," he agreed cheerfully. "I'm Kale, by the way, in case you were wondering." She hadn't been, but she filed the name away. "Clara," she said. "I know." He smiled at her expression. "You were pointed out to us when we arrived." Well, to him, specifically. I was simply standing close enough to overhear. Clara studied him for a moment. "Who is him?" Kale's smile widened in a way that suggested she had asked exactly the question he had hoped she would. Before he could answer, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Unhurried, evenly spaced. The footsteps of someone who was never in a rush, because the world tended to wait for him. The gray-eyed man appeared in the entrance of the alcove. He looked at Kale first. Something passed between them. Not quite a reprimand, not quite permission. Something more like an acknowledgement. Then the gray eyes moved to Clara, and settled there with the same unhurried steadiness she had felt across the hall. Up close, the stillness about him was even more pronounced. It was not coldness. It was the particular quiet of deep water, not empty, but impossibly composed. "You were at the edge of the hall," he said. His voice was low and even, without performance. "Before you left, a man spoke to you." Clara held his gaze. Many men speak to many women at a gathering, my lord. This one made you leave. It was not a question. Clara felt something shift faintly in her chest. Not embarrassment, but the mild discomfort of being seen more clearly than she had intended. It was a private matter, she said. Edmund Voss, he said, as though reading from a document. Son of Lord Aldrich Voss of the Ashfin Pack. He courted you privately for nearly a year. Tonight he has declared for your younger sister instead. The alcove was very quiet. Outside, the distant sound of the gathering continued. Voices, the scrape of benches, someone laughing too loudly near the hearth. You are well informed, Clara said carefully. It's my business to be, he replied. I am Ronan. He said it the way people state facts about geography. This is the mountain. This is the river. Without title, without flourish, in the tone of a man who had long since made peace with the weight his name carried. Clara knew the name. Every wolf in the 7 territories knew the name. Ronan of the Iron Spire. King of the United Packs. AlphaKing of Calden Vale, whose rule had ended 2 decades of border wars, and whose authority was recognized from the frozen passes of the north to the coastal holds of the southern shore. A man who was said to speak rarely, decide quickly, and never repeat himself. She had not expected him to be standing in a small stone alcove speaking to her about Edmund Voss. Your Majesty, she said, and bent her head in the formal acknowledgement of rank. Don't, he said quietly. Not unkindly, just with the mild firmness of someone removing an obstacle. Not here. She straightened and looked at him directly, because he seemed like the kind of man who would find evasion more offensive than boldness. Why were you watching me? She asked. Cale, still leaning against the wall, made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Ronan did not look at him. Your scent reached the entrance before we crossed the threshold, Ronan said. I have been in every major gathering in this kingdom for 15 years. I have never encountered it before. Clara blinked. My scent. It is unusual, he said simply. Old. The kind that belongs to bloodlines that no longer exist, or that have been. Obscured. She did not know what to say to that. In the world of the wolf packs, scent was not a casual thing. It carried lineage, health, power, status. It was the first truth a wolf read about another, before name or title or reputation. To have a scent that an Alpha King found remarkable was not a small thing, but it also made no sense. Clara was the unremarkable eldest daughter of a minor noble family, with no distinguished lineage that she knew of. Her mother was a second daughter of a second son. Her father's pack had been absorbed into a larger territory before she was born. There was nothing unusual about her. I think you may be mistaken, she said. I am not often mistaken about scent, he replied. From the hall, a horn sounded. The formal signal for the declaration ceremony, the part of the gathering where bonding announcements were made before the assembly. Edmund and Sina would be among them. Clara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She moved to step past Ronan toward the corridor. You don't have to go back in, Cale offered from behind her. I know, she said. But I will. She felt Ronan's gaze on her back as she stepped into the corridor. She did not turn around. She walked back toward the hall with her spine straight and her chin level, and the deep blue dress moving quietly around her feet. She would not hide in an alcove while her sister received what had been promised to her. She would stand in that hall, and she would watch, and she would feel whatever she needed to feel, and tomorrow she would still be Clara, still be standing, still be entirely herself. She entered the great hall just as Edmund led Sina to the center of the floor. The crowd parted for them. Voices hushed. Lord Aldrich Voss stood near the Ashfin banner, with the satisfied expression of a man whose arrangements had gone according to plan. Sina was radiant in her gold dress, her eyes bright, her smile perfectly calibrated between joy and modesty. Clara found a place near the left wall and stood very still. Edmund spoke the formal words. Sina accepted. The hall filled with the sound of approval, stamping feet, raised cups. The particular noise of 500 wolves witnessing a bond declared. Clara watched. She did not cry. She had not expected to, but she was glad of it anyway. What she did notice after a moment was that the noise in the hall had shifted slightly. A new current moved through the crowd. Awareness, tension, the particular alertness of wolves who had registered a dominant presence. She did not need to turn to know that Ronan had followed her back into the hall. But it was the voice of the old pack elder near the hearth that she heard clearly above the rest, speaking to another elder in the carrying tone of the hard of hearing. "Is that the king? What is he looking at?" And the second elder, quieter but not quiet enough. "The woman by the left wall, the one in blue." Clara felt the weight of it settle over the room like a change in weather. One by one, heads turned. Not toward the couple at the center of the floor, where a declaration had just been made. Toward her. Edmund, mid-bow, looked up. His expression when he found her face, and then traced the direction of the crowd's attention to whatever stood behind her, was something Clara knew she would remember for a long time. Not because it gave her pleasure, but because it was the first moment all evening that he looked, for just a fraction of a second, like a man who understood the precise size of his mistake. The morning after the gathering arrived, gray and cold, with frost on the inner courtyard stones, and a sky the color of unpolished iron. Clara had not slept well. She rarely did after nights that asked too much of her composure, when the effort of holding herself together left a particular kind of exhaustion in the bones. Not the tiredness of labor, but the tiredness of performance. She rose before her sisters, and dressed without the help of a maid, as she had always preferred. The blue dress was folded carefully and set aside. She put on her traveling clothes. A dark wool dress, a gray cloak with a worn hem that she had repaired twice, and the boots that had been resoled so many times. The cobbler in the village market had begun to greet her by name. She pinned her dark hair back simply, and went down to find something to eat before the castle stirred fully awake. The kitchens of Stonemark were already busy with the preparation of the morning meal for the assembled packs. A young kitchen servant, a girl of perhaps 15 with flour on her apron and a wary expression, handed Clara a heel of bread and a cup of warm broth without being asked, recognizing in her the particular look of someone who needed nourishment before conversation. Clara sat on a low bench near the kitchen hearth and ate in silence. She was halfway through the bread when Lena found her. Lena was the one person Clara had not expected to see at this gathering, and therefore the one person whose presence immediately made everything feel slightly more manageable. They had grown up together in the same village, daughters of neighboring families, bound by the particular closeness of two girls who had each recognized in the other someone who thought more than they spoke. Lena had married 3 years ago and moved with her mates pack to the Eastern Territories, and Clara had missed her with the quiet constancy of missing someone you cannot quite explain to people who never knew them. She came through the kitchen door wrapped in a brown cloak, took one look at Clara's face, and sat down beside her without a word. They stayed like that for a moment, shoulder to shoulder near the fire. "I heard about Edmund," Lena said finally. "I assumed you would." "I also heard something else." Lena paused, turning her cup slowly in her hands. "Clara, people are talking. People are always talking." "About the king," Lena said, with the careful emphasis of someone placing a fragile object on a surface and watching to see if it holds. "About where he was standing last night. About what he was looking at." Clara broke a piece of bread and ate it. "He was curious about my scent," she said. "He said it was unusual. It means nothing. Kings notice things. That is their function." "Ronan of the Iron Spire does not notice things without reason," Lena said quietly. My mate served under his command during the border campaigns. He says the king does not look at anything he does not intend to understand completely. Then he will be disappointed, Clara said. There is nothing remarkable to understand. Lena looked at her for a long moment, with the particular expression she had always reserved for the moments when Clara said something Lena believed to be profoundly wrong, but chose not to argue with directly. Your grandmother, Lena said instead. The one who left you those silver clips. Clara touched them automatically. She had worn them again this morning. What about her? Do you know anything about her pack? Her bloodline? Very little. She died when I was 4. My mother never spoke of her much. Why not? Clara had never asked that question with any particular urgency. It was simply one of the many silences her family kept, the kind that accumulated over years until they became furniture, present, unnoticed, unquestioned. I don't know, she said. Lena nodded slowly, as though this answered something. Before Clara could ask what she meant, the sound of boots on the stone corridor outside the kitchen door announced company. The kitchen servant retreated to the far end of the room. Lena straightened slightly. The door opened, and Cale leaned through it with the comfortable manner of someone who had never in his life entered a room without being certain of his welcome. There you are, he said, addressing Clara with the easy familiarity of someone who had decided they were already acquainted. Do you know how many cold corridors I have walked through this morning? I did not ask you to find me, Clara said. No, but he did, Cale replied, without any particular drama, as though this were a perfectly ordinary piece of information. Lena made a small, controlled sound beside her. Clara set down her cup. Why? She said. Because he wants to speak with you. And because when Ronan wants something, he tends to pursue it with a thoroughness that the rest of us find either admirable or exhausting depending on the day. Cale stepped fully into the kitchen, glanced at Lena with a brief, polite nod, then back at Clara. Will you come? To speak with the king. Yes. Privately. In the East receiving chamber, with myself and Davon present, if that concerns you. Devon is the third one before you ask. Copper hair, looks like he knows a secret. He usually does, which is deeply irritating. Clara looked at Lena. Lena's expression said, with perfect clarity and without a single word, go. The East receiving chamber was a long room with a low-beamed ceiling and windows that looked out over the frost-covered training yard below. A fire burned in the hearth. 2 chairs and a table had been arranged near the warmth, and the copper-haired man, Davon, evidently, stood near the window with his arms folded and the expression of someone running a series of private calculations. Ronan stood at the far end of the room with his back to the door, looking out over the training yard. He turned when she entered. He was dressed simply again, dark wool, a plain belt, no ornamentation that she could see. It struck her once more, as it had the night before, how completely he managed to fill a room without appearing to try. You found her, he said to Cale. In the kitchen, eating bread with admirable composure given the circumstances. Leave us, Ronan said. Cale opened his mouth. Both of you, Ronan added. Devon unfolded his arms without comment and moved toward the door. Cale followed, pausing only to give Clara a brief look that communicated something between good luck and this is genuinely interesting to me. And then the door closed and Clara was alone with the AlphaKing. She remained standing near the door. Not from fear, but because she had not been invited to sit, and she was not the kind of woman who presumed. Sit, please, Ronan said, gesturing to the chairs by the fire. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, then took the chair across from her. Up close and in daylight, the gray eyes were even more precise than they had appeared the night before. They held the quality of someone who had spent years reading situations and people, and had developed a patience for it that had long since ceased to feel like effort. "I want to ask you about your grandmother," he said. Clara went very still. "Her name," he continued, "was Maren, of the Veldrath line." The name meant nothing to Clara. The second part sent a faint, unlocated tremor through her that she could not explain. "How do you know that?" she asked. "Because I have been looking for someone carrying that bloodline for 6 years, he said. The Veldrath were a founding pack, one of the original 7 that established the territory treaties before the Unification Wars. They were believed extinct after the Ashburn conflict, 40 years ago. He paused. Your grandmother survived. She hid her lineage when she married into a minor family, presumably to protect her children from what remained of the old feuds. Clara listened to this with the particular sensation of hearing a story that was both completely foreign and quietly, deeply familiar, the way a dream sometimes is when you wake from it. Impossible to verify, impossible to dismiss. If this is true, she said carefully, then my mother knows nothing of it. Your mother was kept in ignorance deliberately. Your grandmother was protecting her. And the scent? Veldrath bloodlines carry a specific marker. Very old, very strong. I was told of it years ago by the eldest of my council, who knew the original 7 packs personally. He looked at her steadily. When you walked into this hall last night, I knew within 10 seconds what you were, what you come from. Clara sat with this for a moment. Outside, the frost-covered training yard was beginning to fill with the figures of early rising warriors running drills in the cold morning air. Their breath steamed above them like small clouds. What does this mean? She asked. Practically. For me. It means your standing is not what you have been told it is, he said. It means the dismissal you have lived with, from your family, from men like Edmund Voss, from the packs that overlooked you, was built on a lie. Not one you told. One that was told around you. Clara looked at the fire for a moment. She had spent 26 years being the unremarkable one, the one who sewed her own dress, who resoled her own boots, who ate bread in kitchens while her sisters slept late in comfortable rooms. She had built a kind of strength from that invisibility, a quiet, internal architecture of self-reliance that she trusted more than anything anyone had ever offered her from the outside. She was not certain she knew what to do with the information that the invisibility had been a construction, that underneath it, there had always been something the world would have treated very differently if it had been allowed to see. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Ronan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the same even directness he had used for everything else, with no attempt to soften or ornament. Because I have spent 6 years ruling 7 territories alone, he said, and because the woman I choose to stand beside me must be someone the old bloodlines will recognize, not for politics. A brief pause. And not only for bloodline. Clara met his gaze. You do not know me, she said. No, he agreed. That is why I am asking you to remain at Stonemark for the duration of the gathering, rather than leaving with your family tomorrow. It was not quite a request and not quite a command. It occupied the precise space between the two, which Clara suspected was exactly where Ronan lived most of the time. She looked at the fire again, then back at him. I will consider it, she said. Something moved in the gray eyes, not surprise. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, very briefly, like the specific relief of a man who had prepared himself for a refusal and had not received one. That is enough, he said. She stayed. It was not a simple decision, and she did not pretend to herself that it was. She sent word to her father through a castle messenger before the family carriage departed. A brief, carefully worded note explaining that she had been asked to remain by the king's invitation and would return home when the gathering concluded. She did not elaborate. She did not ask permission. She was 26 years old and had been making her own quiet decisions for long enough that asking permission had stopped feeling like an option some years ago. Her father's reply came back within the hour, carried by the same messenger, whose expression suggested he had run both directions. The note contained 4 sentences. The first expressed shock. The second expressed confusion. The third expressed a concern for propriety, that Clara found somewhat late in arriving, given the years her family had spent not particularly worrying about her. The fourth gave his consent with a speed that told her the shock had lasted approximately as long as it took to consider the implications of a king's invitation. Sina's departure from the castle courtyard was not something Clara witnessed directly, but Lena, who had decided to extend her own stay by 2 days on the grounds that her mate would survive without her, reported that Sina had stood beside Edmund Voss in the courtyard, with her gold dress exchanged for traveling clothes and her new status as his declared mate sitting visibly on her shoulders like a garment she had not yet broken in, and that she had looked once toward the castle windows before the carriage moved. Clara received this information while sitting in the castle's small library, where she had gone because the alternative was standing in her borrowed room, trying to make sense of everything she had learned that morning, which felt less productive than reading. She looked guilty, Lena said, settling into the chair across from her. For what it's worth. It isn't worth very much, Clara said, without particular bitterness. Sina didn't make Edmund's promises. She only accepted what he offered. I find I'm more at peace with her than I expected. And Edmund? Clara turned a page. Edmund I find I'm entirely finished with. Lena smiled at her reading. Good. The remaining days of the gathering moved differently than Clara had anticipated. She had expected when she agreed to stay that she would be largely left to herself, noticed in the abstract, occasionally pointed at, otherwise ignored. She had not expected Ronan to be as deliberate as he was. He did not overwhelm. He did not pursue with the loud, performative attention that some alphas used as a substitute for genuine regard. What he did was more precise, and in its precision, more disarming. He sought her out once a day, always in the late afternoon, always in places that were relatively quiet. The library, the corridor overlooking the eastern courtyard, the long gallery where the portraits of old pack lords lined the walls in faded frames. He spoke to her about things she had not expected a king to know or care about. The architecture of the castle's oldest wing, the variety of herbs grown in the kitchen garden and their uses in winter ailments, the politics of the northern border territories, which he explained with the directness of someone who had stopped simplifying things for audiences and was simply talking. He also listened. This was the thing Clara had not anticipated and was not certain how to manage. In her experience, powerful men spoke. They announced, they declared, they performed. Ronan asked questions and then waited with complete attention while she answered them, as though her answers were information he genuinely intended to use. He asked about her childhood, about the work she had done on the family land, about the books she had read and which ones she found dishonest, about what she thought of the Southern Pack Lord's proposed treaty revision, which surprised her enough that she laughed before she could stop herself. "You're asking my opinion on the treaty revision," she said. "Yes. I'm the unmated eldest daughter of a minor noble family with no political standing." "You were?" he said. "The situation has changed somewhat. You told me 3 days ago. I haven't had time to form treaty opinions yet." "You have opinions on everything else," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite a smile, but occupied similar territory. She told him what she thought of the treaty revision. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said she had identified the same weakness his Eastern Council had spent 3 months arguing about, and she had located it in approximately 4 sentences. She did not know what to do with that either, so she moved on. Cale and Devon were constants at the edges of these encounters, and Clara found, somewhat to her surprise, that she liked them. Cale was exactly what he appeared: direct, restless, generous with his amusement and his honesty. Devon was quieter and more watchful, with a dry humor that appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly, leaving Clara uncertain whether she had imagined it. They treated her without condescension, which she noticed because she had grown accustomed to its absence being remarkable. On the fourth day, the incident occurred. It happened in the main hall during the midday meal, when the assembled packs were largely gathered and the noise was at its height. Clara was seated at a side table with Lena and two women from the Greymore pack she had been introduced to the previous day, when Lord Aldrich Voss, Edmund's father, made his way across the room toward her. He was a broad man with a gray beard and the particular expression of someone who had arranged the world to his satisfaction and found disruptions to that arrangement personally offensive. He stopped before her table without greeting the other women, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how this conversation would go. "I understand you've been receiving particular attention this week," he said, loudly enough that the tables nearby went quiet. "I have been a guest of the castle," Clara said. "My son tells me you've been speaking privately with the king." "Many people speak with the king during a gathering, my lord. That is rather the purpose of a gathering." Lord Aldrich's expression tightened. "A woman in your position would do well to consider how such attention appears. It is one thing to be noticed in a moment of curiosity. It is another to conduct yourself as though that curiosity implies something more permanent. You would not be the first woman to mistake a king's attention for an offer." The hall was very quiet now. Clara was aware of it. The particular listening silence of a crowd that has scented conflict and drawn back just enough to watch without appearing to. She set down her cup carefully. "You are speaking to me," she said, her voice even and clear enough to carry, "about how I should conduct myself. At a gathering, in a castle where I was invited to remain by the king himself." She paused. "I wonder, my lord, whether you have considered how that appears." Lord Aldrich opened his mouth. "Lord Voss." The voice came from behind Clara. She did not need to turn to identify it. The quality of the silence changed, deepened, shifted, in the specific way it always did when Ronan entered a space. Lord Aldrich turned. His color changed in a way that was almost interesting to observe. "Your Majesty," he said, with a bow that was deeper and faster than it would have been 30 seconds earlier. "I believe you were speaking to my guest," Ronan said. He had come to stand beside Clara's table. He did not touch her. He did not need to. His presence beside her was a statement as clear as any formal declaration. "I hope the conversation has been pleasant." The pause that followed lasted exactly long enough to be a message. "Of course, Your Majesty," Lord Aldrich said. "Good," Ronan said. "Then I won't keep you." Lord Aldrich left. He moved quickly for a large man. The hall exhaled around them, voices resuming with the slightly elevated energy of people processing something they would be discussing for weeks. Ronan looked down at Clara. "You handled that well," he said quietly, "before I arrived." "I had it managed," she said, equally quietly. "I know," he said. "I arrived because I wanted to, not because you needed me to." She looked up at him. There was something honest in the distinction he had drawn, the difference between rescuing and choosing to stand beside. She had spent enough time being dismissed by people who should have stood beside her to understand precisely what the difference meant. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and moved away to speak with the pack lords at the central table, as though nothing of particular significance had occurred. But the room had rearranged itself around what had just happened, and Clara could feel it. The shift in how eyes moved toward her, the subtle recalibration of her place in the architecture of the hall. Lena pressed her knee briefly under the table. Clara looked at her. Lena said nothing. She didn't need to. On the 6th and final evening of the gathering, Ronan found her in the long gallery, standing before the portrait of a woman she had noticed on her first day. The woman in the portrait was dark-haired, with sharp, steady eyes, and a bearing that Clara had privately thought, without knowing why, looked familiar. She knew why now. "She looked like you," Ronan said, coming to stand beside her. "My grandmother," Clara said. "Marin." "Yes. That portrait was moved to storage 20 years ago. I had it returned to the gallery 2 days ago." Clara looked at him. "You knew it was here," she said. "The castle archivist located it the morning after the gathering opened." He looked at the portrait. "I thought you should see her, as she was, before she made herself invisible." Clara looked at the woman in the portrait for a long moment. Marin of the Veldrath line. A woman who had hidden an entire identity to protect her children, who had folded her history into silence and passed on only 2 silver hair clips and a scent too old and too strong to fully erase. "She was protecting my mother," Clara said. "She was, and in doing so she left you without the knowledge of what you carried." He paused. "That ends now, if you choose." Clara turned to look at him directly. In the amber light of the gallery's torches, the gray eyes were warmer than they appeared in daylight. She had learned, over the course of 6 days, to read the small variations in his expression that substituted for the broader emotional displays other men used. The slight change in the set of his jaw, the quality of attention in his gaze, the way he went even more still when something mattered to him. He was very still now. "You told me on the first morning that the woman beside you must be someone the old bloodlines recognize," she said. "You told me that, and then you spent 6 days asking me about treaties and books and kitchen gardens. So I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer me the same way." "Yes," he said. "Is it the bloodline?" she asked. "Or is it me?" The gallery was quiet. Somewhere in the distant hall, music had started. A slow, low melody played on strings, the traditional close of a gathering. "It is you," he said. "The bloodline is why I could identify what I was looking at. It is not why I have spent 6 days in libraries and corridors when I have a kingdom to administer." Clara held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded, once, the same way he had nodded at her after Lord Aldrich left. A small, precise acknowledgement that something real had been exchanged. "Then ask me properly," she said. And for the first time since she had met him, Ronan of the Iron Spire smiled. It was not a large smile. It was brief and quiet, and entirely genuine, and it changed his face in a way that Clara suspected very few people had ever been in a position to witness. "Clara of the Veldrath line," he said. "Will you come to Ironspire as my chosen?" She looked once more at the portrait of her grandmother, at the steady eyes, at the bearing that had always been hers, waiting for her to grow into it. "Yes," she said. Ironspire earned its name. Clara understood this the moment the carriage crested the last hill and the fortress appeared against the winter sky. A castle built not wide but tall, its towers rising in narrow pointed spires of dark stone that pierced the clouds like the teeth of something ancient and unbothered by the cold. It sat on a granite outcrop above a river valley, surrounded by pine forests so dense and so dark that the trees seemed less like vegetation and more like a standing army that had simply decided to take root. She had traveled for 4 days to get here. Cale and Davin had ridden alongside the carriage for the entire journey, and she had come to understand, somewhere around the 2nd day, that this was not purely ceremonial. They were her escort, yes, but they were also, in the particular, unspoken way of men who had served a long time under the same command, something closer to companions. Cale had talked for most of the journey, which Clara did not mind, because he talked about things worth hearing, the history of the Ironspire territories, the names and temperaments of the pack lords she would encounter, the unwritten customs of the court that no formal introduction would ever cover. Devon had contributed, at irregular intervals, observations so precise and so dryly delivered that Clara had on 2 occasions laughed before she realized she was doing it. Ronan had ridden ahead to prepare the castle's reception. She had not seen him since the gallery. She had thought about him with a frequency she found slightly inconvenient and entirely honest. The Ironspire court received her with the careful, watchful attention of a community that had learned to read everything. There were no grand celebrations planned. Ronan was not a man who staged spectacle for its own sake, and Clara was grateful for this. What there was instead was a formal introduction in the great hall of the castle, conducted before the assembled household, pack lords, warriors, and council members who made up the permanent population of Ironspire. Ronan stood at the front of the hall when she entered. He was dressed as she had come to expect. Dark, unornamented, completely composed. His council stood to his left. 7 men and 2 women of varying ages and expressions, several of whom looked at Clara with the barely concealed assessment of people who had opinions they were professionally obligated to keep temporarily to themselves. She walked the length of the hall with her spine straight, and her grandmother's silver clips in her hair, and the same deep blue dress she had worn to the gathering, because she had decided that the dress deserved a better ending than the one it had initially received. Ronan extended his hand when she reached him. She took it. "Clara of the Veldrath line," he said to the hall, "comes to Ironspire as my chosen. She will be received with the full honor of that standing, and her word in this court carries my trust." It was not an elaborate speech. It did not need to be. In the hall of the AlphaKing, those 2 sentences carried the weight of a formal decree, and every person present understood precisely what they meant. The council bowed, the household followed, and Clara, who had spent 26 years being the unremarkable one, the unmarried one, the one standing at the edge of rooms waiting to be seen, stood at the front of the Ironspire Great Hall and felt the strange, settling sensation of a thing arriving that had always been meant to. The weeks that followed were not simple. She had not expected them to be. Learning the workings of a royal court was not a small undertaking, and Clara approached it the way she had always approached difficult things, methodically, without self-pity, with the willingness to ask questions she might have been embarrassed to ask if she had cared more about appearing to already know the answers. She met with the council. She walked the castle's territories with the head of the household staff, an older woman named Paris, whose initial skepticism softened over the course of 2 weeks into something that Clara eventually identified as reluctant respect. She learned the names of the pack lords and their allegiances. She sat in on treaty discussions, at first only listening, and later, when Ronan began to direct questions to her in the presence of the council, answering. The council had not been unanimously pleased by her arrival. 2 members in particular, Lord Fenrath, the eldest, and a sharp-faced woman named Councillor Wynne, had made their reservations known through the particular diplomatic language of people who expressed doubt without technically voicing it. Clara had expected this. She did not take it personally. She understood that she was an unknown quantity arriving in a court that had run on established patterns for 15 years, and that the appropriate response was not to demand acceptance, but to earn it. She earned it the way she had always earned things, through patience, through consistency, through paying careful attention to the things that mattered and declining to waste energy on the things that didn't. Lena came to Ironspire 6 weeks after Clara's arrival, at Clara's invitation. She stayed for a fortnight, and her presence was, as it had always been, the particular comfort of being known by someone who had known you before you became something. They walked the pine forest paths along the river valley and talked with the ease of women who had never needed to perform for each other. "You're different here," Lena said on the last morning of her visit, looking at Clara across the small table in Clara's sitting room, where a fire burned against the January cold. "Am I?" Clara said. "Not in the way I was afraid of," Lena clarified. "You're still you. You're just more of it, like something stopped pressing down." Clara thought about this. "Something did," she said. The bonding ceremony was held in the first week of spring, when the snow on the Ironspire peaks had begun to melt, and the river valley below ran high and loud with snowmelt. It was a private ceremony by the standards of what a king's bonding might have been. Attended only by the council, the pack lords, the household, Kale and Davin, and Lena, who had returned for it and stood at Clara's side throughout with the quiet solidity of someone who understood exactly what this moment meant and intended to honor it properly. Ronan spoke his vows in the same way he said everything, without ornament, with complete attention, as though the words were not a performance, but a decision he had made clearly and intended to keep without reservation. Clara spoke hers with the same steadiness. They were not vows about perfection or permanence as an abstraction. They were vows about choice, the specific, conscious choice to stand beside another person with full knowledge of what that meant. When it was done, Kale made a sound that he immediately and unconvincingly disguised as clearing his throat. Devon looked out the window at the river valley with the expression of a man who had something in his eye. Lena did not pretend to do either of these things. She simply let the tears stand without apology, which Clara thought was the most honest response in the room. Lord Aldrich Voss sent a formal letter of congratulation 3 days after the ceremony. It was precisely worded and entirely devoid of warmth, which Clara found almost more satisfying than a genuine apology would have been. Edmund sent nothing, which she had expected, and which cost her nothing. Sina sent a short letter 2 months later. It was hesitant and imperfect, and genuine in a way that Clara suspected had cost her sister something to write. She replied to it, not warmly, not with false forgiveness for things that had not been fully reckoned with, but with the measured honesty of someone who had decided that carrying old wounds past their usefulness was a form of self-imprisonment she was no longer interested in. The correspondence continued, carefully, over time. It did not become what it might have been if things had gone differently, but it became something real, which was perhaps more valuable. Her father visited in the summer. He was a smaller man than Clara had remembered, or perhaps Ironspire simply made everything outside it seem reduced by comparison. He stood in the great hall with an expression that moved through several stages before settling on a kind of humbled pride that Clara received without comment. She showed him the castle. She introduced him to Ronan, with the quiet confidence of a woman entirely at home in her own life. He left 3 days later with the look of a man quietly rearranging his understanding of his eldest daughter, which was, Clara thought, the best outcome she could have reasonably expected. That autumn, in the gallery where the portrait of Marin had been returned to its rightful place on the wall, Clara stood alone one evening before her grandmother's painted face. She thought about the 40 days of needle and thread, the deep blue dress, the calluses on her right hand, the 2 silver clips, the kitchen hearth and the bread and Lena's shoulder pressed against hers in the early morning cold. She thought about the long corridor she had walked with her spine straight when she needed to fall apart, and the alcove where she had gone to breathe, and the gray eyes that had found her across a crowded hall, and simply, with no drama, no announcement, no apology for the fact, refused to look away. She thought about her grandmother, who had hidden a whole identity in the name of love and safety, and left her granddaughter only 2 silver clips and a cent too old to erase, trusting that it would be enough. It had been enough. Clara reached up and touched the clips in her hair. The fire in the gallery sconce burned warm and steady at her side. Behind her, she heard the quiet, even footsteps she knew better now than any sound in the world. Ronan came to stand beside her. He looked at the portrait. He did not speak, because he had learned, or perhaps had always known, that some moments do not need words to be complete. She leaned very slightly against his shoulder. He stayed. That was the whole of it. The entirety of the story. A woman who had been made invisible by the people around her until she walked into a room where the right eyes were finally looking, and was seen, completely, permanently, without reservation, for exactly what she had always been. The portrait of Marin looked down at them both with her steady, familiar gaze, and the fire burned. And outside the iron spire towers, the autumn stars were beginning to appear, one by one. In the darkening sky above the pines, Clara was home,